Her phone was on the kitchen counter. Her car was in the garage. Her purse was right where she left it. But Shanann Watts and her 2 young daughters had completely vanished. And when police arrived, her husband was already lying. On a Monday morning in August, the Frederick Police Department received a call that would unravel one of the most haunting cases in recent memory. A friend was worried. A pregnant mother of 2 had vanished. Her car was in the garage. Her purse was on the counter. Her phone, her lifeline to the world, was sitting silently on the kitchen table. The only answer was an empty house and a husband who seemed too calm. The call came from Nicole Atkinson, Shanann's closest friend, a woman who knew her better than almost anyone else. Nicole had been trying to reach Shanann since the weekend, and every unanswered text and ignored phone call sent a deeper wave of anxiety through her. This was not normal. Shanann Watts lived her entire life through her phone. She was the type of person who posted updates about her day, who shared photos of her children's accomplishments, who documented every moment of her pregnancy journey. She was a social media influencer in her own right, a woman who thrived on connection and communication. For her to go silent for an entire weekend was unthinkable. Nicole had called Chris Watts first, hoping he could provide some reassurance, but his response only made her more concerned. He told her Shanann had gone on a playdate with a friend, that she was probably just busy. But Nicole knew better. She knew Shanann's schedule, her habits, her routines. There was no playdate on the calendar. There was no friend she had mentioned. Something was wrong, and Nicole could feel it in her bones. She made the decision to call the police, a choice that would set in motion one of the most intense and heartbreaking investigations in Colorado history. She asked the dispatcher for a welfare check, explaining that Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant and had not been heard from. The dispatcher took the information and promised to send someone out to the house immediately. Nicole waited, her heart pounding, hoping that she was wrong, hoping that Shanann would answer the door and explain everything. But deep down, she knew the truth was going to be far worse than she could ever imagine. The call was placed at approximately 1:40 p.m. on August 13, 2018. Within minutes, Officer David Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department was en route to the Watts residence at 2825 Saratoga Trail. He had no idea that this seemingly routine welfare check would become the defining case of his 19-year career in law enforcement. He had responded to missing persons calls before, but this one felt different from the start. The dispatcher mentioned the pregnancy, the young children, the concerned friend. There was an urgency in Nicole's voice that Officer Coonrod would later describe as chilling. He arrived at the house to find a quiet suburban street, the kind of neighborhood where people wave to their neighbors. Allergy, and that Shanann always carried an EpiPen with her everywhere she went. That EpiPen was still on the countertop inside the house. Officer Coonrod began to piece together a picture that was increasingly troubling. People do not leave their phones, their purses, their medication, and their children's life-saving medical equipment behind when they go on a playdate. They do not leave their shoes by the door and their car in the garage. Every instinct in Officer Coonrod's body told him that something was deeply wrong, that this was not a simple case of a woman who had taken her children to a friend's house and forgotten to tell anyone. He called Chris Watts, the husband, asking where he was and when he could return to the house. Chris responded from work, sounding calm and collected, telling the officer that he would be there in about 45 minutes. There was no panic in his voice, no urgency, no desperate questions about whether his wife and children had been found. He simply said he was on his way. Officer Coonrod noted the lack of emotion, filing it away in his mind as something worth remembering. When Chris arrived, he walked up to the officers with a composed demeanor that struck inconsistency and continued his search. He walked into the bedrooms of Bella and Celeste, expecting to find signs of life, signs that the children had been there recently. The rooms were clean, the beds made. The girls' favorite blankets were nowhere to be found, a detail that Chris mentioned as well. He pointed out that the girls never went anywhere without their blankets, that they slept with them every night and carried them everywhere they went. The blankets were gone, but everything else was left behind. The toys, the clothes, the diapers, the school supplies. It looked like someone had taken only the essentials, only what they needed for a short trip. But even that did not make sense, because Shanann's purse and phone were still there. Officer Coonrod asked Chris about the marital situation, and Chris admitted that they had been having problems. He said they had been discussing separation, and that they had been planning to sell the house. He mentioned an emotional conversation that had taken place the night before, but he downplayed its significance. He said they had talked about the future, about what was best for the children, about how they would handle the end of their marriage. It was civil, he insisted. They were both calm and rational about it. But something about the way he described it made Officer Coonrod uncomfortable. The details seemed rehearsed, the story too polished. He wondered if Chris was hiding something, if there was more to the emotional conversation than he was letting on. He also noted that Chris had not asked a single question about where Shanann might be, or what might have happened to her. He seemed more interested in presenting his version of events than in finding his wife and children. The search continued throughout the afternoon, with more officers arriving to assist. The neighbors, many of whom had gathered on the street to watch the commotion, were questioned about anything they might have seen. Nathan, the next-door neighbor, approached the officers with a piece of information that would become crucial to the investigation. He told them that he had security cameras installed on his house that captured the entire front of the Watts property. He offered to show them the footage, hoping it might contain some clue about what had happened to Shanann and the children. Nathan was a family man himself, a father and a husband who was as shaken by the disappearance as everyone else. He had noticed strange activity on the morning of August 13th, and he wanted to help in any way he could. He led the officers to his home and pulled up the footage from his security system. At 5:27 a.m., there was a clear image of Chris Watts backing his work truck into the driveway of his own home. This was unusual because Chris had told the officers that he left for work at 5:30 a.m. and that he had left by pulling his truck out of the garage and driving away. The footage showed something entirely different. Chris had backed his truck into the garage, not pulled it out. He had positioned it so that the rear of the truck was accessible from the back of the house, hidden from view of the street. The officers watched as Chris made several trips from the garage to the driver's side of the truck. He was carrying items, but the camera angle was such that they could not see exactly what he was carrying. The footage showed Chris moving deliberately, methodically, without the urgency of a man who was trying to get to work on time. He seemed to be loading something into the vehicle, something that required multiple trips. The officers took note of the timestamps and the duration of each trip. They knew they were looking at a piece of evidence that contradicted everything Chris had told them. They continued to watch the footage, hoping to see Shanann or the children leaving the house. but the cameras showed only Chris and his truck. There was no sign of Shanann, no sign of Bella or Celeste. It was as if they had simply disappeared into the house and never come out. Chris stood next to the officers as they reviewed the footage, but he did not watch the screen. He stared at his phone, looked at the floor, fidgeted with his hands. He seemed uncomfortable, agitated, anxious. He kept trying to explain away the footage, saying he was just loading his tools and his lunchbox for work. But the officers knew that a man who was loading his tools did not need to back his truck into the garage and make multiple trips to the driver's side. There was something more going on, and Chris's behavior was confirming their suspicions. The officers had seen enough to warrant a more thorough investigation. They contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, requesting assistance with what was now clearly a missing persons case with potentially criminal implications. The resources poured in, with forensic experts and experienced investigators descending on the Frederick neighborhood. A team of crime scene analysts was assigned to conduct a comprehensive forensic search of the Watts residence. They were looking for evidence of blood, signs of a struggle, indications of a cleanup. They used specialized equipment and trained canine units to pick up scents and detect hidden traces of biological material. The search was painstaking, meticulous, and exhaustive. The investigators combed through every room of the house, lifting fingerprints, collecting fibers, analyzing every inch of carpet and upholstery. The canine dogs, trained to detect human remains, were brought in to sniff for any signs of death. They were particularly focused on the master bedroom and the children's rooms, areas where Chris had claimed his family was last seen alive. The dogs did not alert to the presence of any remains, which meant that if something had happened in the house, it had been carefully cleaned. The absence of evidence was itself a piece of evidence. It suggested that someone had taken great care to remove any trace of what had occurred. The investigators noted the missing bedsheet and the general state of cleanliness in the house. They wondered what had been washed away, what had been disposed of. What had been hidden from their view. They also noted that the house was locked from the inside when they arrived, a detail that suggested the family had been there and had not left through the front door. The investigation was still in its early stages, but the pieces were starting to form a picture that was increasingly troubling. Meanwhile, news of the disappearance was spreading through the community and across social media. Friends and neighbors were posting pleas for information, sharing photos of Shanann and the girls, hoping that someone had seen them. The missing persons alert went out, broadcasting to the public the description of Shanann and her children and the circumstances of their disappearance. The reaction was immediate and intense. People who knew Shanann were in shock, unable to believe that she could simply vanish without a trace. Her parents, Frank and Sandra Ruzick, received the news with a mixture of disbelief and terror. They drove to Colorado to be closer to the investigation, to be near their daughter, to help in any way they could. The family unit, once so close and loving, was now fragmented by grief and fear. Chris Watts remained at the center of the investigation, cooperating with authorities, but also under increasing scrutiny. His behavior was being analyzed and reanalyzed by experienced investigators who had seen countless cases like this before. The investigators wanted to speak with Chris Watts in a formal setting, away from the chaos of his home and the media circus that was beginning to gather outside. They invited him to the Frederick Police Department for an interview, framing it as an opportunity to help them understand what might have happened to his family. Chris agreed, arriving at the station with his father, Ronnie, who had flown in from out of state. The interview was conducted by FBI Special Agent Graham Coder, a veteran investigator with decades of experience in high-profile cases. Agent Coder had a reputation for his calm demeanor, and his ability to extract information from seemed to have memorized the details and was reciting them from a script. Agent Coder asked him to write out a formal statement, knowing that written statements often reveal inconsistencies that spoken words do not. Chris wrote his statement without hesitation, describing the same timeline, the same events, the same conclusion. The statement was polished, but it lacked the emotional weight of a man whose wife and children were missing. There were no pleas for their return, no descriptions of their personalities, no expressions of fear or hope. It read like a business report, not a personal account of a family tragedy. Agent Coder asked Chris about the affair, the one that investigators had discovered through his phone records. Chris denied it, claiming that he had never been unfaithful to his wife and that he would never do such a thing. He was emphatic, almost indignant, as if the very suggestion was an insult to his character. Agent Coder noted the denial and filed it away, knowing that it was just another piece of the puzzle. The interview continued for several hours, with Agent Coder asking increasingly pointed questions. He asked Chris to look at photos of his family, hoping to elicit an emotional response. Chris looked at the photos, but his face remained expressionless. He commented on the clothes Shanann was wearing, the shoes she loved, the dress Bella was so fond of. He spoke of them in the past tense. Agent Coder noted the past tense references, a significant psychological indicator in cases of missing persons. People who believe their loved ones are still alive speak in the present tense. They say she is, and they are, not she was, and they were. Chris was talking about his family as if they were already gone, already lost, already dead. Agent Coder pointed this out to Chris, asking him why he was speaking about his wife and children as if they would never return. Chris stumbled for a moment, trying to explain away the verbal slip, but he could not fully recover. The damage was done. The investigators had another piece of evidence to add to the growing pile of inconsistencies and lies. Agent Coder asked Chris about the emotional conversation he had described, wanting to know more about what had happened that night. Chris recounted the conversation again, but this time he added new details. He said that Shanann had been upset about the separation, that she had cried for hours, that she had begged him to change his mind. He said that he felt guilty for causing her pain, but that he was determined to move forward with his life. He described himself as the victim of his own conscience, a man who was doing what he had to do, even though it was difficult. The self-pitying tone was hard to miss, and Agent Coder wondered if Chris was trying to elicit sympathy or justify his actions. He asked Chris if he had been having an affair, hoping to provoke a different reaction. Chris denied it again, but his voice was slightly less confident this time. He seemed to sense that the investigators knew more than they were letting on, that they were holding back information and waiting for him to slip up. He became more guarded, more defensive, more protective of his secrets. The interview stretched into the late afternoon, with Agent Coder and other investigators rotating in and out of the room. Chris was offered food and water, but he declined. He seemed tired, drained, exhausted by the interrogation. He asked if he could leave, but the investigators told him they still had more questions. They had not yet told him about the He described himself as the victim of his own conscience, a man who was doing what he had to do, even though it was difficult. The self-pitying tone was hard to miss, and Agent Coder wondered if Chris was trying to elicit sympathy or justify his actions. He asked Chris if he had been having an affair, hoping to provoke a different reaction. Chris denied it again, but his voice was slightly less confident this time. He seemed to sense that the investigators knew more than they were letting on, that they were holding back information and waiting for him to slip up. He became more guarded, more defensive, more protective of his secrets. The interview stretched into the late afternoon, with Agent Coder and other investigators rotating in and out of the room. Chris was offered food and water, but he declined. He seemed tired, drained, exhausted by the interrogation. He asked if he could leave, but the investigators told him they still had more questions. They had not yet told him about the polygraph test they wanted him to take, the test that would determine once and for all whether he was telling the truth. Chris grew increasingly anxious, a calm facade beginning to crack. He knew the polygraph was coming, and he knew he could not pass it. He knew that the lies he had been telling were about to be exposed, and he had no idea how he was going to escape. The investigators knew they had him cornered, and they pressed the advantage, asking more questions, pushing harder, demanding answers. Chris began to backtrack on some of his previous statements, saying he was tired and confused, and that he might have misremembered certain details. The investigators did not buy it. They had seen this pattern before, the pattern of a liar who is slowly backing away from his own story. They knew that the truth was coming, and they were prepared to wait for it. The polygraph examination was scheduled for the following morning, giving Chris a night to think about what he had done and what he was going to say. He arrived at the police station with his father, Ronnie, who had been staying at a nearby hotel since arriving in Colorado. Ronnie was there to support his son, but he was also there to protect him, to make sure he did not say anything that would incriminate himself. The investigators knew that the presence of a parent could complicate the interrogation, but they had a plan to get around it. They separated Chris from his father, leading him into a room where the polygraph equipment was set up. The examiner, Tammy Lee, was a veteran of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, a woman who had conducted hundreds of polygraphs and who had a gift for putting people at ease. She knew how to make people comfortable, how to build rapport, how to get them to lower their defenses. She also knew how to read the signs of deception, the subtle cues that revealed when someone was lying. She began by explaining the process to Chris, telling him what to expect and how to respond. She warned him that the polygraph was not infallible, but that it was a useful tool for separating truth from fiction. She also warned him that if he failed the test, there would be serious consequences. Chris agreed to take the test, his face betraying no emotion. Tammy asked him a series of baseline questions, establishing his normal physiological responses. Then she asked him the questions that mattered. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Did you lie about the last time you saw her? Do you know where she is now? The machine recorded his heart rate, his breathing, his perspiration levels. The results were clear and damning. Chris had failed every question. The machine had detected deception in his responses, indicating that he was not telling the truth about any of the critical issues. Tammy took the results to the investigators, who were waiting in an adjacent room. They reviewed the data and confirmed what they had suspected all along. Chris Watts was lying about what had happened to his wife and children. The polygraph results provided the probable cause they needed to escalate the investigation to an interrogation. They brought Chris back into the room and confronted him with the evidence. He initially tried to defend himself, but his confidence was gone. He was no longer the calm, collected man who had arrived at the police station the previous day. He was a man who had been exposed, a man who was running out of options. The investigators pushed harder, demanding the truth, telling him that the polygraph had proved he was lying. They told him they knew about the affair, that they had uncovered it through his phone records and text messages. The revelation hit Chris like a physical blow. He realized that the investigators had known more than he had thought, that they had been holding back information and waiting for the right moment to use it against him. He dropped his head in his hands, exhausted and defeated. The interrogation shifted to a confrontational mode as the investigators realized that Chris was still hiding something. They began to employ more aggressive techniques, challenging his story, pointing out the inconsistencies, accusing him of being responsible for the disappearance of his family. They told him that the polygraph results had proved he was lying, that there was no way to escape the truth anymore. They asked him about the affair, about how long it had been going on, about whether Shanann had known about it. Chris admitted to the affair, breaking down in tears as he confessed to the betrayal.
But he was careful not to admit to the murders. Not yet. He was still trying to protect himself, still trying to find a way out. The investigators recognized this as a tactic, a way to deflect responsibility and buy himself time. They knew that he would eventually have to confess, that the weight of the evidence would be too much for him to bear. They continued to press him, asking him to explain why he had lied about the affair, why he had denied it when the truth was so obvious. Chris stammered, trying to justify his actions, but he could not come up with a credible explanation. He knew he was caught, and he knew that his only option was to tell the truth. He asked to speak with his father, hoping that Ronnie would be able to help him. The investigators considered the request, recognizing the risk of allowing another person into the room. They knew that Ronnie could tell Chris to stop talking, to lawyer up, to
protect himself. But they also knew that Ronnie could be a tool for obtaining the confession they wanted. They decided to allow the meeting, but they would monitor it closely. They set up
a camera and a microphone in the room, capturing every word that was spoken. Ronnie entered the room and sat down with Chris, the two of them facing each other across a small table. Ronnie could see the desperation in his son's eyes, the defeat that had settled over him like a shroud. He asked Chris what had happened, what was really going on, why the investigators were so convinced that he was guilty. Chris hesitated, then began to speak in a low, trembling voice. He told his father that he had seen Shanann strangling the children, that he had tried to stop her, that he had killed her in a fit of rage. He presented himself as the hero, the protector, the man who had to make an impossible choice. Ronnie listened in shock, unable to process what he was hearing. He asked Chris why he had not called for help, why he had not taken the children to a hospital. Chris had no answer. He just sat there, his eyes staring at the floor. The investigators watched from the observation room, their faces grim. The confession, when it finally came, was both shocking and deeply unsettling. Chris admitted to killing his wife and children, but he framed the act as a reaction to a crime that Shanann had allegedly committed. He told the investigators that Shanann had taken the children's lives, that he had acted in a moment of rage and grief. The investigators were skeptical, recognizing the self-serving nature of the story.
But they allowed him to continue, knowing that any confession was better than none. They asked him where the bodies were, and Chris described the location where he had buried Shanann and hidden the children. He told them about the oil tanks, about the shallow grave, about the sheet that he had wrapped around his wife's body. He gave them the coordinates and described the scene in detail.
The investigators noted the information and immediately dispatched a team to the location. They found what Chris had described, confirming the worst fears of everyone involved. The investigation was now a homicide case, with Chris Watts as the primary suspect. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were recovered and identified, bringing a grim end to the search that had captivated the nation. The case was far from over, however. The trial was still to come, and the public was hungry for answers. Chris continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that he had acted in self-defense and that Shanann was the true killer. But the evidence told a different story. The autopsies proved that Shanann had not killed her children,
that she had been the victim of a brutal attack. Chris's story fell apart, and he was forced to accept a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The case was closed, but the questions remained. How could a seemingly normal man commit such a horrific act? What had driven him to destroy his own family? The answers were not clear, and they likely never would be. Chris Watts took those secrets with him to prison, refusing to fully explain his actions. The families were left to grieve, to try to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of the tragedy. But they would never forget the victims, the vibrant woman and the beautiful children whose lives were cut short
by a man they had trusted. The story of the Watts family murders would continue to haunt the public consciousness, a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. It was a tragedy that defied explanation, a crime that seemed to come from nowhere and left a trail of devastation in its wake. In the years since, the case has been the subject of documentaries, books, and countless discussions, but the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. Why did Chris Watts do it? The answer may never be known.